Hey guys, Spudknocker here, as always, and today I figured we'd do another kind of cloud surfing discussion video in which we talk about a topic that came to my attention today that I thought many of you guys out there who fly the DCS World F A-18C Hornet would be very interested in. Now this is something that I don't think very many people know about yet, and so I figured it'd be a great topic to discuss together. So let's go ahead and hop in the cockpit of our Kuwaiti F A-18C Hornet. Now it is very specific that I chose the Kuwaiti skin for our jet today because we're going to be discussing the Hornets that have been recently retired from the Royal Kuwaiti Air Force. So let's go ahead and hop in and get started. So we'll go ahead and kick off the autopilot here and we'll kind of trim the jet out. We got a bit of an interesting asymmetric loadout. We've got a couple GBU-12s, a GBU-32, and a couple AMRAAMs on the wings. And we've got a lightning pod on the cheek station. So, this topic came to my attention today as I was browsing through the military aviation world of Twitter, and it was a very interesting little topic that I thought you guys, like I said, would be very interested in, especially those who fly the F A-18C Hornet in DCS World, and of course who make skins for the F A-18C. Now, as we all know, the Kuwaiti Air Force has ordered and has started receiving brand new Super Hornets for their relatively tiny Air Force. I believe the full number of their order was 28 Super Hornets of a mix of FA-18Es and Fs. And similar to the production of the F variants for the Royal Australian Air Force, the Kuwaiti Air Force FA-18Fs in the future could potentially be turned into EA-18Gs if the Kuwaiti Air Force decides to put the funds to that. I believe they have some of the wiring and harnesses in place to make that possible, very similar to the FA-18Fs that were received by the Royal Australian Air Force to replace their F-111 aardvarks back in the early teens. And so this, of course, leaves Kuwait with a batch of, I believe, a total of 31 FA-18Cs with a mixture of 8 FA-18Ds thrown into that 31 number. That was their original purchase order. I believe all of them survived. I don't think any of them have crashed. And interestingly enough, there's actually a Kuwaiti FA-18 pilot out there who runs a public Instagram channel and posts pictures of his adventures across the Middle East in a Kuwaiti FA-18C. That's, if I remember the Instagram handle, I'll put it in the comment section of this video for you guys. So anyway, with the arrival of these new Super Hornets to Kuwait, there's no reason to keep the legacy Hornets around anymore. These jets were bought in the shakeup of the Kuwaiti Air Force post Operation Desert Storm, in which Kuwait itself was liberated by the coalition from the Iraqi army, in which the Kuwaiti Air Force really didn't play too much of a role. There were some operations by its A4KU, or for Kuwait, Skyhawks, during Operation Desert Storm, and a couple of operations, sorties that were flown in defense of the nation as the Iraqi army steamrolled through the tiny country of Kuwait. The Kuwaiti Mirage F1 fleet that did escape to Saudi Arabia, along with their French counterparts, were grounded for the vast majority of Operation Desert Storm as a result of the coalition wanting to avoid any blue-on-blue mistakes of French and or Kuwaiti or other coalition forces who were flying Mirage F1s, but being confused with the F1 EQs that were flown by the Iraqi Air Force. But that's getting away from our main topic today, which is, of course, the fate of these legacy Hornets that have flown with the Kuwaiti Air Force. Now, these legacy Hornets are relatively young. As we said, these were only bought post-1991. Kuwait was the second to last country to receive their FA-18s after Finland, or sorry, before Finland, I should say. And so as a result, these FA-18s are relatively young when it comes to Western-built fighters. They have lived in a small country for the most part with very tight airspace confines, which limits the aircraft to more or less short-range missions. We'll talk about in a little bit why that could potentially be more stressful in the airframe in just a second, but we'll keep on with this trend here. Of course, they can fly out into the Gulf and utilize international airspace over the international waters of the Persian Gulf. They've participated in some combat flying over areas such as Yemen, as well as over Iraq during Operation Southern Watch, as well as the 2003 invasion, and of course the repelling of ISIS from Iraq in the 2011 to 2014 timeframe, and they have also seen some combat over Syria during the Syrian Civil War. But for the most part, these Hornets are relatively young. It's especially in comparison to, say, the F-A-18Cs that are still being flown by the United States Marine Corps at this point, and the F-A-18s that are being retired wholesale from the United States Navy as they move to an all Super Hornet fleet and F-35 fleet at this point. Now, there are some things to think about when you do have very restricted airspace for your Air Force to maneuver in. There were some studies done that indicated that airframes from smaller countries, say for instance, let's take Finland or Switzerland for instance, noticed that their airframes were fatiguing at higher rates than the actual hours in the logbook for that aircraft would denote. And the reasoning for that, which contractors from Boeing had kind of figured out, was the fact that those countries such as Switzerland or Finland, because they're smaller, they have more airspace restrictions, their actual ranges where their jets are going to be training and performing high-stress maneuvering, dogfight training, rolling in on targets to drop bombs, things like that, things that are going to put high G on the aircraft, occur a lot, and they occur in very short time frames. So whereas a American Hornet might be, of course, being slammed in the deck of an aircraft carrier, an American Hornet has to fly a relatively long distance, especially if you think about the ranges around, say, Marine Corps Air Station Miramar. They have to fly a relatively long distance to get to a range where they can then do that hard maneuvering. So therefore, the logbook hours that are on, say, the Swiss or the Finnish F-A-18s, those are hard hours in the logbook, whereas the American equivalent may have more hours in the logbook of simple transit times, flying nice and straight and level, no hard maneuvering, things like that, whereas those smaller countries, their jets are going to get up in the air, they're already at the range, they're going to do their hard maneuvering, and then they're going to land. Every hour in the logbook of a smaller country's F-18 is going to be very harsh on the airframe of that aircraft. For the most part, there are exceptions, and I definitely know that that is not a completely perfect rule, of course. Man, these new clouds in the sunset are just really, really pretty. And my little AI buddy wingmen here are doing a good job staying with me. I'm not doing anything totally crazy today, which is okay as we discuss this topic. So anyway, the actual story that we're talking about here is the fact that these are not brand new, but they're relatively new, relatively young FA-18 airframes that can go to somebody. Somebody can buy them. And it came to my attention today that the Tunisian Air Force, the TAF, in Northern Africa, are looking at potentially buying these 31, or at least a number of these of that 31 Kuwaiti legacy Hornets that are still around, for their own Air Force and their own defensive needs. This makes a lot of sense. The TAF only flies in a offensive, or rather defensive for this country's role, the F-5E and F Tiger II, and of course a slew of helicopters of mixed Western and Russian/Soviet origin. And these F-5s are tired. They arrived in Tunisia between 1984 and 1985. They've been around a lot. They have been upgraded over the years, but not nearly as substantially as, say, the Super Tigers from Brazil or other countries that have really invested in their Tiger fleet. That's because Tunisia is such a small country. They don't really have too much to worry about being in Northern Africa, and they don't really need to invest all that heavily in their Air Force. However, recent, world events have kind of come into play with the Libyan civil war, and some of that civil war even potentially spilling over the border into Tunisia, forcing the Tunisians to have to kind of take a hard look at their defense spending and thus kind of prop up their defense spending and how much they're going to spend. And they realize that their F5s just aren't going to cut it anymore. They put out a tender for, lightweight, cheaper fighter aircraft, potentially replace their F5s. And unfortunately, out there in the market today, there is no F5 equivalent for the most part. I guess you have the F-A50. And so there are a couple different countries and a couple different companies that put up aircraft for that tender. The F-16V, of course, from Lockheed Martin. You have the L-159 from Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, I should say. You have the Gripen from Sweden in there as well. And a lot of these things just didn't fit the bill, right? The F-16V, even though it says on Wikipedia they've ordered the aircraft, they really haven't. It is too expensive. It's too much capability in too expensive a package. The Gripen is in the same boat. It's a little bit too expensive, and it's not American made, which comes into play in just a moment here. And it's just going to be a little bit too much for what they need. And of course, the L-159 from the Czech Republic, and it's just not capable enough. The price tag is good. It just can't do what the Tunisians need it to do. And so the Tunisian Air Force and the Tunisian government are looking at purchasing the surplus FA-18C and Ds from Kuwait, which, if it goes through, which this one source that I read through, which I would not necessarily consider an official source by any means. Well, it's more of a rumor spreading forum, I guess you could say. It has the backing of the State Department, which I would imagine is probably true, because Tunisia is a very stable, forward-thinking democracy. A lot of their parliament is made up of, I think if I looked last, it was around 30% female. So a lot of very progressive representation, very stable democracy in a part of the world that isn't necessarily so stable. So I'm sure that the United States would have, and especially the State Department, would have no problem transferring higher end military technology to the Tunisian Air Force and the Tunisian military as a whole. And the source said that the United States was freeing up funds, and they weren't necessarily released under President Trump, and are in the process of being released by the Biden administration for $500 million in military aid to help the TAF acquire these FA-18C and Ds from Kuwait, bring them to Tunisia, and get them up and running with the TAF. And this would be a major boon to the TAF and allow them to protect their airspace in a much more modernized and more capable fashion, with a lot of the craziness that is happening just across the border in Libya. And it's important to remember that the Libyan civil war is just as complex and just as crazy as the Syrian civil war. And a nice liberal democracy next to that kind of craziness is not something the United States, as well as Europe, is really excited about. As well as there's a lot of air threats in the Libyan civil war that aren't necessarily seen in the Syrian civil war, such as militia groups, breakaway generals with their own forces flying and reactivating old Libyan Arab Air Force MiGs, like MiG-23s, MiG-25s, things like that, that even in a much degraded form would probably overpower Tunisia's F-5 Tigers pretty handily, if worse came to worse, and say those MiGs that were flown by non-state actors and rogue generals actually wanted to penetrate into and go after something in Tunisian airspace. An F-5, even in its slightly modernized form, would just not fit the bill anymore. So an FA-18C is going to be the absolute perfect thing to fit that bill at a low price tag, low hour airframes for the most part. I'm sure these airframes are in good shape. The Kuwaiti desert is dry. It's air it out there, so I'm sure that corrosion hasn't been necessarily too big of a problem for the Kuwaiti Air Force on these airframes. So in my opinion, it seems like a really, really cool transfer of technology, and is going to be something that I think DCS World pilots would be very interested to hear about, and why I wanted to bring this story to you guys. Definitely let me know in the comments section what you think, whether you think this is just a complete fabrication and total rumor, or if you think it's, you know, potentially going to happen. And I'm sure we'll see a Tunisian Air Force skin for the A-18C Hornet pop up here on the ED website in pretty short order. They paint their F5s really, really cool in a very interesting desert camouflage that is very reminiscent of the Iranian Asia Minor camouflage, which could be very, very handsome on an FA-18C or FA-18D for that matter. And I've always thought that the grayish, greenish camouflage that the Kuwaitis applied to their FA-18s were always very, very cool. And I'm glad that that very interesting and unique camouflage scheme is being transferred over to their Super Hornets, and I think slightly in a different form over to their brand new EF2000 Eurofighters. So I hope you guys enjoyed listening to this video, and I hope you enjoyed some relaxing cloud surfing here in DCS World in the FA-18C Hornet. And of course, you guys know how much I love making these videos of just talking about my favorite topic, which is of course fighter jets and air forces around the world. So fly safe out there, guys, and of course, stay healthy. We'll see you in the next one.